So thanks Gunnar for inviting me to give some comments. It's very exciting to do so. This has been my favorite subject for a few decades, and it's nice to see just how big it's become. I want to start by advertising my book, since I have a book on policy instruments actually in Vietnamese. I don't know, it's a guy called Phuong who translated it, and I haven't been able to find him, but I'm hoping to meet him on this trip somehow. So when I actually sat I think in 98, 99, and did research on this book with Mike Thoman, who's here in the audience. He invited me to RFF, and I also sat at the World Bank and wrote this book, the first version in English, and it's since then it's been updated by Jessica Correa. There's a second edition, and there's different language editions in Chinese, Spanish, and Vietnamese. So we already heard some great comments. I'd just like to add a few. There's a lot of different ways of categorizing environmental problems and environmental instruments, and you can categorize them by whether they're point sources or non-point sources, whether the damage is heterogeneous or not, and whether the marginal cost of abatement are the same or not the same, all kinds of things like that. I think for practical purposes, today I'll just choose one division, which is between the really big ones in terms of potential revenue and the other ones that are not going to generate a lot of revenue, but which still can be very important for the environment. So in the first category, we have, of course, everything related to climate. Carbon pricing, maybe in some cases even some non-carbon pricing, methane pricing in the future. But basically just carbon pricing or energy pricing. This is related to a lot of local air management and traffic and industry and stuff. But this has the potential to generate very large amounts of revenue, and I'm later going to say that I think we need to think about process, and so here the relevant process is we need to collaborate with ministries of finance as maybe the main force, because ministries of finance are very powerful, and so you have to go into that knowing that you're going to be talking to the Ministry of Finance. Then we have a lot of in some countries mining can generate very significant resources, or could. Very often this is unexploited, and for instance, my own country, which loves taxing things, but we don't tax minerals like we should. We just give away the resources, and I think that's quite a mistake. So there is, and forestry is another case. In many cases, many countries, forests are publicly owned or stand on public land, and the sometimes concessions to harvest are just given away or priced very inefficiently, and there's significant possibilities for revenue. So again, the Ministry of Finance should be involved, and together with ministries of say forestry or natural resources. So that's one category. There's another category of very important issues, which is to do with, say, waste handling, water management, and so on, where you probably will not generate significant resources. The Ministry of Finance is not going to be interested. Still, there are resources that will be generated, and for instance, fees can be a very useful instrument. So in water management, you can have collection of effluent fees or water fees, and these fees can be often recycled within a ministry or within a local municipality or regional agencies or whatever there are, and that's the two categories, I think. One additional principle I'd like us all to remember is that the level of the fees is very important. We tend to fall into, it's a bit of a trap to be like biologists, and we look at all these different kinds of market-based instruments as if they were different kinds of plants or birds, and we start collecting maps of how many you have in different countries, and you get these tables, which we've seen many examples of here. And we should remember that's all very well, but it's just a step. And the most important thing is really to have sizable fees. The level of the fee is very important. And I've seen many of my friends in the IPCC, for instance, they like coloring in maps. And it's a bit like children coloring maps, you know. It's fun. But you see more and more countries have carbon tax, but it's a carbon tax of $1 or $2 or something, and sometimes they have a subsidy at the same time, which is bigger. Now, that's not a real example of a carbon tax, right? So we have to be interested. We need carbon taxes that are really quite high to deal with climate change. So it's much more important to focus on the level. So level is a word I want everybody to remember, the level of the tax, or the level of the price, if we're speaking of a fee. It's more important than anything else. And then we need to think of how we get to this level. So the next word I'd love everybody to remember is political process. As economists, we tend to have sometimes a bit too much of a social engineering approach to this. We optimize the instruments. But political scientists and others remind us that the important issue is really to get the right stakeholders into the room and to create the legal and procedural foundations for a process for these different stakeholders to arrive at a workable instrument. And there will be lobbyists in this process. Lobbyists are strong and very often quite negative, but they can also be positive. And either way, they need to be handled, and we should not be naive about the way in which lobbyists operate. Lobbyism is very important, as are a number of other things like property rights. And I'm often fascinated and a little bit worried when I hear the idea of using a tradable permit for something like air quality in a country where you don't have private property for land. If you don't have private property for land, I don't think the general public and the businessmen and the consumers are very used to the concept of how markets work. And if you don't have private property for forests, for land, for such things, then I sometimes wonder whether starting with air quality is really the right starting point. And in those cases, there might be other instruments like fuel taxes, which would be more appropriate because it's a whole procedure. You think I'm speaking too long? I just started on it. Okay, let me stop with one thing, and that is that we're speaking not of a small, but of a very big field here. Asia and policy instruments to solve environmental problems. We need to approach this in terms of a grand experiment. Think of a 10-year program. Maybe the ADB could lead this or facilitate it, but we need a dozen universities, we need a dozen ministries to collaborate, and we need to test things and to evaluate and do research. We need to have research that is both academic on the one hand, but also practical policy research, where you actually have people who are employed in ministries involved, and all that for basically each area, for water fees, for mining fees, for forestry, for carbon pricing and climate. So this is a program of several large programs, and it's not something that is finished, but it's something that is just started here. And so, yeah, thanks. I echoed many of the comments that that some of you said. I'm aware of that. But anyway, thanks.
I'd like to take questions for the presenters. You may have questions to specific presenters, or you can have questions to all of them.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Hoai from Central Institute for Economic Management in Vietnam. I feel a great honor to be here today to get to know about the project. I think it's a fantastic project, and I agree with David that this is the most comprehensive and systematic research project on the market-based instrument, and I think it will contribute a lot to the cause of the sustainable development in the region as well as in the global. I think I find the most interesting on the project is that it tries to link with not only the academic research but also policy-oriented research. So I think from the policy point of view, I would expect the project to have a broader aspect in terms of the market-based instrument, in terms of the way to look at market-based instrument. Because as you know, from the policymaker point of view, whenever you would like to apply any instrument or policy, you will need to look at not only one aspect as environmental aspect, but also in terms of the social equity aspect, and also in terms of economic growth aspect. So from this, for example, in Vietnam, we know that we need to reduce subsidies for the electricity power. But we cannot do it right now because it may affect on the inflation and on the sustainability of the economy. So from this aspect that I recommend to add one more aspect in the analytical frameworks of how to choose or to select the market-based instrument, and also how to the factor affecting the performance of market-based instrument. That to add one more aspect, that is a development context. It's not only the environmental characteristic. It's not only the institutional characteristic, but also the development context. So that is one point. And the second point is also from the policy point of view. I would expect that the research in the future of the project will focus or do more research in terms of the policy impact assessment. As one presenter also point out, this is one of the not only few research on this aspect, but also it's also very important for when you would like to introduce a policy to instrument into the reality. You need to do impact assessment. It's not only the ex post impact assessment, but also the ex ante assessment, impact assessment, meaning that to do the impact assessment before introducing the policy. So I think that is my expectation. And also one more thing is that in addition to what you mentioned in the report, you will present the low-hanging fruit option. And together with that, I would expect you also present some best practice in applying the instrument. It will be very useful because when you apply one policy, it depends on different context, different various factors. So you will see, if we have the whole picture, we will see how it's applied in the real world. So finally, congratulations. I think it's a great project, and I look forward to the future research. Thank you.
Can I respond quickly?
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's hope we can have more questions and comments. We're running out of time. So, yes, thank you. These are, of course, incredibly insightful comments. When it comes to the analytical framework and what we actually looked at, of course you're right, and we had such limited time today to go into this. So one thing that we were acutely aware of when we went into this, given decades of research on this in the past, is also the political feasibility of the implementation of, for example, carbon taxes that has been discussed, or subsidy reform. And that is typically very much related to distributional implications too, right? So this is something that we have tried to bring in both kind of throughout in the text, but specifically in the 8 case studies, that it's its own kind of annex of 100 pages back to back with the report. So I can only say that yes, you're right, and this is really fundamental, and it shows just the complexity of what we're looking at. A brief example, Thomas put together experience from fuel taxation and how it affected the poor in 25 countries, and he found that despite what all these riots and so on about the potential impact of the poorer the country, the more progressive are these taxes, right? But still, there is rightly a concern of particular policymakers when it comes to the implications. And we have yet another example. Mike Toman is here, is leading a study in Ethiopia with a very elaborate dynamic CGE, computable general equilibrium modeling of the distributional implication of a carbon tax, right? So I think that also policymakers, they are acutely aware of this, and our role as economists will be to, as well as possible, actually give the best possible evidence there so that they can take this decision, because they are much more concerned about those things than the kind of optimality that David was talking about.
Okay, Hoi, thank you for your question. I think I should give also the background that Hoi and CIEM have been a research partner of ours for many years, and I think there's some background also to her question in that she has done this kind of dynamic CGE modeling for Vietnam, where we looked at low carbon development options, and we did an estimation of marginal abatement costs for specific levers, a bottom-up analysis, and then Hoi ran it through her CGE model to look at the distributional effects of the package of measures that we had put together. So I'll just respond on a few things of what Hoi said. I generally agree with your comments. I think a lot of the contextual things and a lot of the differences in the instruments and what has conditioned effectiveness where evidence is available would be useful to further flesh out. On the ex-ante assessment, I would say there are 2 elements. One is purely ex-ante work would be, as you termed it, impact assessment, and we can do that with structural models, and also when we're talking about sort of general policies that affect an entire country, where you have these general equilibrium effects, where there's small interventions that may be the only option. So impact assessment is very valuable also to address these distributional concerns. Impact evaluation, which I would say is empirical estimation of treatment effects and their statistical significance, is also useful to do, but then obviously it can't be purely ex ante. You need some pilots. But I think it's wherever we can, I think it's useful also to do that. but it won't always be useful. So in some cases, it may only be the modeling-based type of approach. Thank you.
So maybe cross-country comparisons, that's what we can bring to this analysis.
Before questions start again, I'd like to remind you to briefly introduce who you are and which organizations, institutions you are at. Any other questions, please, sir?
I'm Mike Tillman from the research department at the World Bank. In the spirit of this being not the end of a study, but the planting of seeds for a longer-term discussion, Thomas actually said the points I wanted to say mostly more eloquently than I could, which is typical. But I just wanted to underscore 4 points that are in the category of making sure you keep track of the broader policy framework and connections when one does analysis of market-based instruments. One is that if there are large tax subsidies for pollution control equipment, that has an effect on how market-based instruments are going to turn out in terms of their cost effectiveness, because they'll inevitably differ in terms of their tax treatment. One might want to get rid of those tax subsidies over time. Second, where you have a lot of state control of a sector, either because it's regulated or owned, I think it becomes very problematic to use quantity-based approaches. Everybody's excited about the Chinese national cap-and-trade system. It's in one sector, electricity, vertically integrated and owned by the state largely, not exactly the most bright setting for a market. I think when we have these situations, and I understand in Vietnam there's much intention now going into equitization, I believe is the term of art for state enterprises, this may be the perfect setting for really using a price-based approach, a carbon tax, a pollution tax, a water fee, etc. With revenue-generating instruments like that, we have to be very thoughtful about earmarks because that can often lead to inefficient or even perverse alternatives. And finally, in the comments that were made about encouragement of solar energy here in Vietnam, first of all, I think we all have to remember that subsidies generally are harder to implement than prices if we want to try to target them well. Second, we should try to have technology neutral instruments where we can because we don't want to necessarily choose one technology over another. And third, when we look specifically at solar, it's well known that there are some very substantial cost differences between rooftop systems and utility scale systems. So if we're going to have some reverse auction or any mechanism to try to encourage those investments, we should certainly try to encourage the ones that seem to make the most economic sense in addition to a good environmental sense. Otherwise, we end up like some countries in Europe with very large expenditures on not very cost-effective ways of providing green power.
There was no question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Jorge Bonilla from the EFD Colombia. Thank you, interesting presentations. I have one question related to the whole topic about policy dialogue and how to design very good policies for market-based instruments. In the case of Colombia, we have identified that there are several constraints to implement policies to cut pollution for the air, for water, or waste. But the situation is that these 3 main constraints are political will. The second one is the institutional coordination, because some of these topics like air pollution, water, it's not only handled by one sector, you have to involve several sectors at the same time. And the third main constraint is that there are national policies. When you, for instance, in the case of air pollution, you say we have to impose taxes for air pollution and you have to pay using the principal pays case. But in this situation, sometimes the policy includes the word taxes for air pollution, but it's difficult to translate this tax to the local level because it requires to develop in detail the law. And it's difficult even if we have, for instance, some cities that would like to be ahead of the rest of the country. They cannot do any policy related to that because they have to wait until the government develop the details of the law. So these 3 main constraints, for instance, in the case of air pollution, working in that topic, it's difficult when you go to a city and they want to cut pollution. it's difficult because they don't have a way to get out of this situation. I don't know if you have some recommendations for that, how to deal with these three constraints, or maybe if there are other constraints that you think that are very important for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the presenters. A very interesting presentation. My name is Somanath and I'm at the EFT Center in India. I just wanted to say that regard to research going forward, I think one of the things that really is very crucial to examine is the incentives of various players in the system. And in particular, I think that what's missing from most of the analysis by economists of policy instruments is the incentives of politicians. So the incentives of people within the government to take actions. And those incentives vary quite significantly depending on the level of government, for example, that they are at. Whether it's local or state or national, it depends. It varies enormously across countries, varies very much with political systems. So if you have a political system in which the government, the ruling party is basically stable and it's going to be there forever, then the incentives of players within that system are much more long-term, relative to a system in which there are regular elections and then governments change very frequently. So if governments are changing very frequently, then the incentives of politicians you have to have, whatever policy you're proposing, it better have results very quickly before the next election. So those kinds of things change the picture completely differently. And so certain kinds of instruments aren't going to work. And then if you want to think about this, it really matters, the distributional effects of any policy and how those are handled really become crucial to whether that instrument is even worth talking about. So I really think that going forward, we want more systematic research directed in this direction, and I don't think we can leave it to political scientists and say, well, it's their business. Because this is fundamental, right? Economists are all about, if we learn anything from economics, it's about analyzing the incentives of the actors. And we really need to analyze the actors' incentives. I don't want to say that that means only the incentives of the political leadership, it's also incentives of other players in the system and how all of those incentives can be aligned. And usually there are going to be several different actors with regard to a particular policy or a particular sector, all of whose incentives have to be aligned before you can implement a particular instrument and make progress. And I think the fundamental difficulty with many of these problems that we have in Asia with regard to air pollution, water pollution, waste, is that the damages are very diffuse. They're very diffuse, they accumulate very gradually, then they get up to a level where the stock of pollutant is very high. Any policy that addresses that will have to draw that stock down. That's going to be gradual, which means that you are only going to see benefits gradually. It's not going to be dramatic. So getting the incentives aligned so that all the actors in the system find it in their interest to act in a way to get that to happen, I think that's the big challenge, and I think that's where more research is needed.
So should give them a chance to say something more on this. When do you close the session?
It's about 12:20.
Okay, so in case you leave.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your comments, suggestions. I really appreciate it. I think this is more than science. I take your point. We need a good science policy interaction. On behalf of ADB, I would like to make a few points. I thank you, all of you, for your great contribution. I'm really happy to come here and see you. I see a lot of potential that we can go even further. I would like to emphasize that our position following our new strategy 2030, we ADB continue to help support sort of applying and scaling up these innovative approaches of market-based instruments. And I think it's important, as you, most of you mentioned, that we need to sort of test, apply, and examine the efficacy of these instruments. That's necessary. And I think I'm glad that we have a good resource that can make it possible. We have not only scientists, economists, but also government officials and other partners like the World Bank, United Nations. I think we can build on those strong foundations to use to advance our initiatives. And again, as I mentioned, I think it's important to continue this kind of science policy dialogue. And I'm glad I met a lot of people who are engaged in EFD. Maybe this can be a great platform to sort of initiate and continue that momentum. And lastly, I would like to call for sort of continuous collaboration among us, consisting of different sort of people with different backgrounds. And I would like to hope to continue to sort of engage with you, and I look forward to working with you in the future as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That a lot of the point made by people in the audience. I think that indeed this is important to look beyond certain set of indicators. That including static efficiencies, dynamic efficiencies, and efficacy. I think there's a lot more, I think, values at stake here in applying market-based instrument. There are, for example, revenue concern for government, and can be itself important consideration, and the equity concern of using these can be another important concern here. So I think in the future, definitely it's important to look beyond. I think it's sort of indicated that looking at from economic analysis perspective. On the other hand, also I think it's important to recognize that there's not just simple dichotomy between command and control and the market base. There are range of other policy instrument out there, right? The legal approach, right? You can civil law and the criminal law and these, and also organizational restructuring can be a very powerful instrument as well. There's a range of and also community-based approach. So this is also important to open it up, looking at a wide range of instrument beyond market-based instruments. So really kind of you can appreciate both the usefulnesses of market-based instruments, but also understand what are the relative shortcomings in comparing with other instruments. For example, this study may indicate to in some areas, government may have no choices but to strengthen their command and control measures here. So perhaps in the short run, the assessment is that those cap and trade system may not work well, or expect to work well in the next 5 to 10 years, so that more efforts need to be paid on command and control and do it well. And the other aspect is also, that the market-based instruments are very rarely used by themselves, stand alone. They typically are actually combined with other instruments here. So this actually create both opportunity in looking at the policy mix, but also create a measurement issue when we look at the effectiveness and so forth, whether or not it's really the combined effect that is important, or you can looking at the effect stand alone from a particular market-based instrument. I think this also creates some measurement challenge here. So. Okay, so that's my comments.
Yeah, thanks. I very much agree with the last comment of the audience that he mentioned about the incentives. And at the end of the day, I think market-based approach, as I mentioned in the slide, is all about incentives of stakeholders that we want to care about, and we want to motivate the economic incentives of stakeholders and everyone regarding to the work environment and environmental management. So maybe in the future we will find, I mean, down the track of the approach, market-based approach, we may find some new instruments and some new solutions on the way. And I very much agree with the idea that we have to analyze the incentives of the government and the states as well. And cannot agree more. Firstly, we know that the government in Vietnam, the government wants to promote market-based approach just because we have a limited budget, and we want to socialize the work to protect the environment and mobilize the resource from the whole society. And that's the first incentive that I mentioned. But there will be many other incentives that will lead to some more ideas on the issues. And again, I hope that on the way we will find some more instruments and some more solutions for the issue. Thank you.
We may have time for the last question from the audience, and I'd like to give a microphone to the lady here.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, I think it's a great report. I'm Saudamini Das. I'm from India EFD Center. So I think, this is for the first time that you are seeing a review of all the Asian countries, and it has the potential of being used as a textbook, a reference material in the universities, because almost every university is offering environmental economics course, and they don't have a one reference where all the countries are being evaluated and assessed. I think we really need to put some work and make it as a textbook for the university. That is one. And then the one more suggestion I have: can you make it as a business case? Because like when you say government, okay, you are not doing well, they don't listen to you. But then you want to say that, okay, you have done this and this is what you have achieved, and if you go one step further, this is more you can do it. In waste management, we see a lot of business case because there are so much of employment is being generated, energy is being generated, and some of the waste management settings have become self-sufficient in energy. And similarly, if you can make a positive case, tell them that, okay, every problem is giving you a scope to do better. So I think that may make the policy more interested in, adopting some of these measures.
Can I just conclude? I think we need to stop if we are going to have lunch today, and there is a new session starting out at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much. So we already have a second edition of the policy instruments, so maybe this will feed into a third edition for Thomas and Jessica to consider with a special edition for Asia with all these case studies. Of course, we would love to do this also for Latin America and Asia, and really start a collaborative on this issue. I think a lot of really good points have been made, and maybe you will hear me echo this on national television tonight. What Professor Shun was talking about, it is a very gradual process. We have to learn as we go, and also we might. What has become very clear in this process is that we're also talking about policy mixes. So we see these kinds of strands coming out. It takes time, gradual process, a lot of learning and mixes. And I think that what we have here today is, a very, very important ingredient for us to be able to speed up this process and really address these environmental problems in a very concerted way. In that case, we need to as researchers, we need to do our part and get really involved in the process if we are going to save this environment and have a more sustainable world to live in. So with this, I would like to thank you all for making it all the way here to Hanoi today. It's been a fantastic start of the Policy Day and of the EFD annual meeting, and I hope that many of you will join the Marine policy session. It's really starting at 1 o'clock.
Well, I think we should have a 1 hour lunch.
So Nam is there. He's the general here. So let him. 1 hour lunch.
1 hour lunch, and my clock shows us it's 12:20. So let's make it at 1:20.
Okay.
Back in the room.
Thank you so much. Thank you.